Good morning, and welcome to our first panel, Governance and Conflict in Fragile States. I am Sebastian Chaskell, and I manage the Peace and Recovery Program at Innovations for Poverty Action, and I will be moderating this panel. In this panel, we will hear about 3 different groundbreaking projects which use randomized control trials in order to test assumptions and uncover what we don't know about how formal and informal institutions work in fragile contexts. In the examples that will be presented today from different institutions, including a Ministry of Labor, a police force, and an informal justice system, in Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Liberia, we'll get to hear about the measurement challenges in these contexts, how they were dealt with, and the unexpected results that emerged. We will begin with Michael Callen, economic professor at University of California, San Diego, who will share his insight from his work on ways to address accountability and service delivery failures through mobile money in the public sector in Afghanistan. We will then move on to Raúl Sánchez de la Sierra, economics professor at University of California, Berkeley, who will speak about his work on quantifying the bribes traffic police officers receive in the Democratic Republic of Congo and testing interventions to reduce this. Then, turning to informal institutions, we will hear from Alexandra Hartman, political science professor at University College London, who will discuss findings from her work, which test the effects of training and alternative dispute resolution in conflict-prone communities in Liberia. Finally, Diana Dalton, Deputy Director of the Research and Evidence Division at DFID, will provide us with insights on how evidence from rigorous research, like these projects, can inform policy. We will have an opportunity for questions at the end of the session. So let's start with Michael.
Okay, well, it's wonderful to be here and to speak about this research in Afghanistan. What I'm going to describe today is a randomized control evaluation of a national priority program of the Office of the Afghan President. It's an initiative to try to reduce corruption in the payment of government salaries. I think it relates very closely to a lot of the themes that Rohini raised. It essentially reflects sort of an effort to use aid strategically to help the Afghan state build one of its own essential and probably fundamental capacities, which is to pay its own workers. To frame things very generally, it's just a fundamental feature of government that much of what they are doing is spending money on the salaries of people who work in government. This is particularly true for service delivery sectors like health and education, where it can be as much as 90% of the money that government spends. And it's particularly true also, so each of the dots here is a different country, with the x-axis being GDP per capita and the y-axis just being the wage bill as a share of government expenditure. It's particularly true in poor countries and in fragile countries that a very large share of what government is doing with its money is paying workers in the government. Surely we've all heard anecdotes that these payments are often delayed. Perhaps they go to people that don't even exist, or certainly go to people that don't attend work. So all of this is really an initiative to try to address some of those issues. Turning specifically to Afghanistan, this is a place that's sort of an outlier in terms of the share of expenditure that goes towards government salaries. So it's about 60% of the government budget that's being spent on salaries. As Rohini mentioned, Afghanistan is a great place to waste money. About $113 billion just on civilian reconstruction aid, so this is excluding any defense expenditure, has been spent. It's probably actually more than that now, again, with sort of potentially limited amounts to show. And salaries in particular represent our long-run commitment to the future stability of Afghanistan. So after the troops have left, after international actors have left, one thing that's been made very clearly both by the US and international donors is a plan to continue to pay particularly police and army salaries. So sorting out how to eliminate corruption in this sector is sort of a priority problem, I think, both for the Afghan state but also for international donors. Leakage in this domain, anecdotally, is argued to be fairly severe. So people will pass around numbers like 40% of people on payroll aren't actually there. I would question these numbers. I would say it's actually an incredibly challenged thing to get even basic descriptive evidence on how much money is being lost in the payment of government salaries. But one thing I can tell you for sure is the president himself would tell you that no Afghan head of state has ever known how many people work in his government. So this sort of represents the first effort to take a comprehensive audit of the payroll and start to get a sense of who's there. The idea that mobile money could be useful for this, I think, has some intuitive appeal, and I'll try to dig into this. It is a challenge. Like anything, these types of reforms are incredibly challenging to implement. But there's a few basic features of mobile money that make it particularly nice. It's something that is going to come. It's going to come in Afghanistan. It's going to come in much of the developing countries. There are already 690 million mobile wallets worldwide, $1 billion transacted every single day via mobile money. So this is sort of an inexorable trend in developing countries. I think this will be the system that delivers financial inclusion. The brick and mortar model has not worked in Afghanistan. I don't see it working anytime soon. I think digital finance is how one creates a formal financial economy in a place like Afghanistan. Just to provide a little bit of background, so the first part of the project I'm going to talk about was a pilot that we ran in the Ministry of Labor. In that specific project, our research partner was Roshan, which is the largest telecom in Afghanistan. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page regarding what mobile money is. It's a pretty simple platform. I can go to a local shopkeeper, give them hard currency. They in turn give me electronic currency. I could transfer that, say, to Raúl. He can then take that electronic currency and go cash that out. Just so we all know what it is, essentially what it does is it makes local shopkeepers, once they become registered as mobile money agents, essentially human ATMs who can cash out for people out of their savings wallet. And so the stated objectives of this reform, these are the objectives of the Afghan government, are first, by giving everyone a mobile money wallet, and when you do this, you collect their biometric information, so you know at least you have a living body, a unique living body for everybody on the payroll. So the first goal of the objective is to eliminate ghost workers, and I'll give you some sense in the pilot of what we've achieved in that regard today. A second goal is to eliminate leakage. So this eliminates several of the stages of the disbursement process, which I'll show you very briefly is quite Byzantine. By eliminating those stages, it's hoped that this eliminates some of the leakage in the process. The third is just to improve the payment experience. So in Afghanistan, we see quite regularly actually salaries are delayed by several months. Sometimes they're paid in batches for several months. It's not always easy necessarily to cash out your salary. And also a related issue is people target them with violence when they're queuing at banks. So as to improve the payment experience. And a final goal is to try to, by enrolling all of the public sector in mobile wallets, is to begin to create sort of the foundation for a digital financial economy. We've done this in 2 stages. The first stage started in October 2016. We worked in the Ministry of Labor. We chose this fairly strategically. This is mostly in Kabul. We had a highly supportive minister. In this ministry, salary represented about 70% of expenditure. Everything I'm going to tell you in terms of hard research results is going to come from this pilot. But this was always a pilot that was segueing into a much larger national program, which is in the Ministry of Education. So the Ministry of Education represents 80% of the non-defense public sector in Afghanistan. So most of the people working in government work for the Ministry of Education are teachers. And there, as in many countries, a very large share of the costs are personnel costs. So 93% of their expenditure are on salaries. So it's a natural kind of first thing to target. This will be a randomized control trial that rolls out nationally. Okay, so I don't want to go into too many details here. In order for us to integrate mobile money into the salary payment system, we had to kind of get fairly deep in the weeds in terms of how it actually works. It's a very Byzantine process. It originates with the principal at the school taking attendance of all the teachers who are there. He sends that attendance list to a district authority who in turn asks the Treasury, which is an office in the Ministry of Finance, for a check to be cut. That then goes through the central bank, through a private bank, to a local branch. And the final step in the chain for many of the teachers actually is for whole entire administrative regions, salaries are just collected by a single representative for all the teachers and brought back to them as cash. Only 4% of people in Afghanistan actively use a bank account. There just aren't that many bank branches in the country, so this is really the only serviceable system to get money to people. And the goal of the reform, which you can see at the bottom, essentially is to cut out these steps of having to mediate money through the bank, and in particular to cut out this step of one individual having to carry people money essentially in a backpack. Okay, so on to the experiment. There are 2 goals in this reform. The first is to audit the payroll and verify that the people who are on the payroll are actually there. And the second is payroll processing, so actually to make sure that people are getting their salary every single month as a mobile money transaction. In this ministry, we were working with 4,700 employees. These are all employees based either in and around Kabul. We have survey data for 959 of them. They're spread across 4 different directorates. So one is a main ministry building, which is a large ministry building in central Kabul. A lot of them are in sort of peri-urban offices, which are orphanages and kindergartens around town. Just so you have a sense of what these people look like, the median salary is about $123 per month. 66% of the employees are female, and they've on average, or I guess at the median, worked for about 15 years in this ministry. When do I have until, by the way? Okay. So a really important part of what we're going to do is look at this request that the ministry is making to the Ministry of Finance, so that the Ministry of Labor is making to the Ministry of Finance for payment. So they make an employee level request every single month for the amount of money that's meant to be authorized as service or as salary. So this is kind of a really important and critical piece of administrative data for us to begin assessing how much is being paid. If we want to identify somebody as a ghost worker, first they must be somebody who has been paid or is being paid for some period. The first thing that I can tell you, so we have data not only on the request, but ultimately on where the money ends up. None of the leakage is actually happening during the mechanical part of the process. So whatever lands either in a bank account or on someone's mobile wallet matches perfectly with what's being requested from the ministry. So the leakage that we observe is not happening at any part of the disbursement chain before essentially it lands in someone's bank account or in their mobile wallet. Okay. So how do we measure leakage? How do we measure kind of how much money is going missing? So we have the amount that's being requested on behalf of each employee every single month. We also just ask them directly, how much was your salary this month? And so we try to frame this fairly agnostically, just a question about how much were you paid, how much did you receive? We calculate leakage here is just the difference between what the ministry says that they're paying them and what they themselves report that they're receiving. And of course, this is something that we're going to want to validate or verify. You could imagine that discrepancies could arise between this administrative record and somebody's self-report for a number of reasons. So we'll just ask, this month, how much less was your salary than what you expected? So just to show you the relationship between those two things, on the x-axis, I have how much people report being underpaid every month. And then I have my own self-recorded, I guess my own calculated measure of the degree of leakage. The first thing to notice is not that many people are reporting being paid more than they actually are. And there is a correlation. So it's not strong, it's certainly not one. But I think there's enough signal here in the way that we're measuring leakage and payment to start to say something about the treatment effect of changing people from being paid via banks to being paid via mobile money. So there are 4,700 employees here. We're going to register everybody with a mobile wallet. So the numbers that I'm going to give you right now regarding the share of people on payroll who are ghost workers is not coming from a randomized comparison. It's just simply a descriptive statistic. Here are the number of people that we said you need to show up and sign up for a mobile wallet in order to continue to receive your salary that never managed to appear. After that, so after we've given everybody a mobile wallet, we're going to randomly assign half of people to receive their payment via cash. The remaining half of people are going to receive their payment using the traditional method in this ministry, which is banks. So on to results. I want to say that this is all extremely preliminary. So the experiment in the Ministry of Education is rolling out as we speak. I'm kind of getting data on that sort of this morning. And the results are sort of still fairly preliminary, so this is kind of very early stage work, and so I want to caveat it appropriately. Okay, so in terms of the number of ghosts, so when we registered people, when we told them that they needed to show up in order to continue to get paid, 405 people didn't show up. So that's about 8.6% of the employees in the ministry. So if they had been permanently removed from the payroll, this would have reduced the wage bill by 9.6%. Just so you know who these are, we had no idea where ghosts were coming from. They're principally people who have either retired, died, or left the ministry, but never been removed from the payroll. Now, an additional very important caveat is no one stopped the ministry from then going out and hiring new people, so they managed to eventually get their wage bill back to what it had been previously, but with real people. In terms of leakage, so money that's going missing, and so I want to kind of reemphasize, this is missing after it hits a person's account. So this essentially has got to be money that they're paying to somebody else at the point of withdrawing their salary. So you can think of it as sort of a tax on their salary. We saw that it was about 5.6% in the group that was paid via banks. That goes down to, for many people, goes down essentially to zero. But the average is 3.5%. You'll see in the distribution, so the solid line is the distribution of leakage for those who are being paid via mobile money. There's this little bump on the right-hand side. That's mostly people that are being paid in peri-urban areas. So my initial speculation on that is they have kind of less ability to shop competitively for where they're cashing out their salary, which might make it a bit easier to shake them down. That's pure speculation at this point. Okay. So finally, in the last few minutes, I want to talk about sort of some policy lessons, and I think these relate to the points that Rohini made that we've learned in the process of this. So first, we are not at all the first people to come up with the idea to use mobile money as a means of reducing corruption in the payment of salaries. This is something that basically, since mobile money appeared on the scene in Kenya, has held a tremendous amount of intuitive appeal. And it's just not worked. It's not worked historically, and this is sort of the first time it's really had traction and is starting to roll out nationally. I think the difference at this point, beyond having a president who is really actively supporting it, is at first kind of not all that much care was given to the details of design. So people's first instinct was to roll this out in the most insecure in rural areas in Afghanistan. There's no mobile money ecosystem in rural Afghanistan. I would speculate that that was sort of strategically an effort to undermine any kind of ability for this reform to succeed. And there's kind of a lot of nuance that goes into understanding this. There are a lot of regulatory and statutory changes that need to happen in order for a mobile operator to be the legitimate payer of government salaries. So there's a lot of kind of really important details in this reform that I don't think were accurately accounted for in prior efforts to implement. The second, and this relates to a point Rohini made as well, it is really, really critical to engage government. So in the first phase of this, it was implemented by a procurement contractor working for USAID. Their deliverable to USAID was essentially to maximize the number of mobile wallets created for government employees. And they'd really made no thought or provision about what would happen when their contract ended. So their goal was to just go out, register as many people as possible, end the contract, and have no vision for how this would sit in government, no vision for who would manage this or scale this in government, and no vision for how it would be sustained. So I think it's challenging. There's a view that the government is corrupt and low capacity. Those, I think, are accurate characterizations of the Afghan government. But this just has no hope of succeeding if it's not a government-led initiative. And so I'd say that's another really critical lesson for the success of something like this. In terms of sustainability, this is an example of people using aid strategically to try to build state capacity. So this is now so milestones in this reform are now explicit triggers for additional bilateral funding, which is a really great way to get people behind the reform. And also a lot of legal and regulatory changes are happening in order to support this. That makes it hard to reverse, also makes it robust to the transition of administrations. Okay, so with that, I'll conclude.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about a project that aims at assessing the implementation of typical anti-corruption policies in the context of a broader understanding of how corruption occurs, which is in general within networks of power relations inside the administration. So I'm going to tell a little more about what I mean by this. This is joint work with Christoph Titeka, who is a political anthropologist at the University of Antwerp. Just a note, this kind of work relies on a lot of qualitative work, and that's why working with anthropologists is important, because a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about are almost impossible to observe to the external observer. So the policy problem that motivates the study is that we know corruption affects many countries, and especially many countries with fragile or weak states. And this is a problem because when we try to implement policy and there is corruption, civil servants spend their time doing other things that generate revenue, and policies do not get implemented the way the government might want or donors might want. There is a number of tools that people have thought already, and governments as well as researchers, to curb corruption. Most of them focus on the incentives of individual civil servants in isolation from the network of relationships that often enable corruption, often induce corruption. One of them is improve monitoring of civil servants, make it costlier to engage in corruption. Another is pay for performance of civil servants, make it more beneficial not to be engaged in corruption or improves performance. And a third of them, which is the one that is most relevant for fragile states, is wage policy. Fragile states find it difficult to invest in monitoring, and so one very commonly used policy to reduce corruption is to think carefully of the wage of civil servants. And in particular, the intuition is if you pay civil servants high enough, they might be deterred from engaging in corruption. So what's the rationale for this policy? It stems from the observation that many civil servants make very little money. In the Congo, for instance, which is where this study takes place, police officers get $70 a month. And so there's two rationales for thinking of wage policy seriously. The first is, as long as there's some probability that the civil servant gets caught engaged in corruption, if his wage is high enough, and often more than his outside options, he will be sufficiently tempted not to be engaged in corruption because he would lose a very valuable job. So that's what's called efficiency wage rationale. Another rationale that many governments often use as well is that if civil servants are very poor, that they are spending a lot of effort in order to get these dollars in order to survive, if they were paid high enough, they wouldn't spend so much effort in order to get this extra dollar because that extra dollar would no longer be so useful. So that's what economists call income effect. And so a few years ago, if you travel to Cuba, you'd notice that police officers would make more than doctors, and the rationale was exactly that they didn't want police officers to be engaged in corruption. Now, a problem with this policy is that if police officers or civil servants are engaged in corruption and are caught in contracts with the supervisors where they have to share the revenues for corruption with their supervisors, or they have specific contracts whereby their supervisors tell them you can keep this productive intersection where you make a lot of bribes in exchange for doing this for me, then raising the wage of civil servants might actually be even counterproductive or might just lead to leakage. And so that's what this study is going to be looking in detail. So the study takes place in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it focuses on the Traffic Police Agency, which is one of the most known corrupt state agencies in the country. The police agency has two major functions. The first is to arrest cars in violation of the law, so it's enforcement. And the second is to manage traffic flows in replacement for traffic lamps. And if I have time, at the end of the presentation, I'll say a few words on the political economy of the absence of traffic lamps, which has to do with the whole system I'm going to be talking about. So these are the two public services that the traffic police is supposed to generate. Here is the traffic police at work when they are regulating traffic. Most people traveling through the streets of Kinshasa will quickly encounter police officers regulating traffic flows. Traffic flows are a very valuable public good in the city of Kinshasa, for instance, where a lot of time is spent in traffic jams. In practice, police officers spend a lot of the time harassing cars in order to get cash, or harassing cars in order to bring the cars to the police station, where a higher bribe will have to be paid to police commanders. Most of what happens at police stations, as you will see in this study, in fact, is only linked to corruption. And so drivers find it a little bit annoying, and so that's a problem for implementing policy. In practice, why do we see the system? Police officers have tremendous pressure to get cash to survive, so they have developed a sophisticated system to generate revenue for their own income. This can be the typical harassment bribes as in the previous photos. This can be bribes that are generated through relationships with drivers. The drivers who travel very frequently through the same intersection pay just a toll fee, which is 50 cents, and there's no discussion, no time loss. And the third type of bribe, which is there is a social norm whereby if the police officer does a good job at reducing traffic jams, you should pay some tip. Police officers are poor and they're doing a service to the nation, so we pay a tip. So you can already see one of the implications when there is an organization of corruption that goes down to even the drivers. When you think of curbing corruption, you might also be curbing public service, in this case, if there is no alternative way to incentivize police officers to regulate traffic jams. Another reason why they spend lots of effort in extracting cash is pressure from their supervisors. And of the last years, a new system has emerged called the quota system, whereby the police officers, in order to get access to valuable intersections in terms of the bribes that they can collect, must send a number of cars to their supervisors, and these cars will generate bribes at the police station. And just anecdotically, one of the things that we realized is that this quota system emerged precisely in 2011 when the head of the National Police developed an anti-petty corruption campaign, which made it difficult to collect bribes at the intersections. And so this, rather than leading corruption to disappear, it led corruption to mutate into commanders asking for cars rather than cash, because asking for cars follows the formal process and cannot be detected. So again, anecdotically, you see how typical anti-corruption campaigns are going to interact with the organization of corruption, so we ought to understand this well. And so in blue, police officers may also provide valuable service. This is the anecdote of traffic jams and tips. And so what this study is designed to do is to understand how typical anti-corruption policy campaigns interact with the hierarchy and affect public service, especially important when these officers, even though they are corrupt, are providing a public service. So just to visualize, this is the typical approach to corruption that starts with the idea of a well-intended government or some policy that wants to be implemented. And a police officer or civil servant that is corruptible looks like blue on the outside, like the government, but actually it's a corruptible individual, so it's red. And so the question is, the government has the choice of increasing the wage of the civil servant until the civil servant becomes blue, which is not corrupt. Now the problem is that in reality, these civil servants are caught in relationships of informal power with supervisors who are also corruptible. Supervisors not only enable corruption, they often induce corruption, and they have designed, especially in the Congo, but in many fragile states, a whole system whereby the behavior of police officers depends on the power of supervisors to fire them, to allocate them to worse intersections, or to sanction them in a variety of ways. So what this study is going to focus on is mostly, first, on this relationship, the relationship between police officers and their supervisors, which was the third quadrant in Rohini's presentation, the relationship between, say, a bureaucrat and the local bureaucrat. And so how is this important? If you think of increasing the wage of a corruptible traffic police officer in this context, most or a share of this wage might just go up to the supervisor. And so unless we understand well the structure of corruption, wage policy might leave corruption unaffected. Second, depending on the nature of how these two are contracting to generate corruption, increasing in wage can even increase corruption. So I'm going to give you the example of the Congo in particular. The commander asks for cars, a number of cars every day, and for cash. And in some places, it would be more efficient for them. They would generate more corruption if instead of asking for cars, the commander asks for cash. Sometimes the commander asks for cars because he doesn't trust the police officer, and the police officer is very poor. So it's possible that at the end of the day, the police officer didn't make a lot of money. And so that's another reason why we have the quota system in this case. And if that were the case, and that's what we're going to be looking at in this study, increasing the wage of a police officer might actually induce them to reduce the quota and increase the cash, thereby increasing the total corruption generated if the quota was inefficient to begin with. So we're going to find evidence that this is the case. In some places, commanders are using quotas because they do not trust poor police officers, and when we increase their wage, they change the contracts and total corruption increase. So this is another example of how the vertical hierarchy interacts with standard policy tools against corruption. The second relationship that we look at in the study, so two relationships only, goes back down to the drivers. And as I mentioned before, drivers and police officers have developed informal contracting that allow the police officers to obtain a relatively stable source of revenue, but also in exchange for something. And the police officers, what do they provide? Well, first, they sell protection against themselves. That's more coercive or extortion. But they also sell traffic jams management, and that is a public service that's valuable. So when you think of increasing the wage of a police officer, if the police officer finds it's relatively risky to accept bribes from drivers, as long as he's paid high enough, he might actually not care much in regulating traffic jams and the money that he will get through regulating traffic jams, unless the government has a parallel or another system to incentivize the police officer. And so this is again what we're going to find when we pay more police officers. We see that they work less at regulating traffic jams, and the traffic jams increase. And so this is one of the caveats that we're going to find. So that's what the study is going to be looking at these relationships here. To provide some context before I move on to the study design, here's a typical structure of a police station in the city. A police station is up. It has 5 members. The commander C. The 2 circles in blue are the criminal police investigators, the only ones authorized by law to assess traffic violations. And in blue, the fine collection agents, which are the only ones authorized by law to issue a ticket. The police station commands police staff at the intersections. These are the crosses. So there's 8 crosses, 2 teams of police officers here. And the formal system by which the police arrest cars is as follows. A possible violation is detected. The police officer then escorts the car to the police station where a formal assessment begins, and then the ticket is issued. So at these 2 steps in the process, corruption occurs. At the bottom, police officers get bribes in exchange for protecting the car against the office. And above, the judicial police officers can also and often ask for cash in exchange for not sending the car to the fine collection agent. This is a typical police station and in the city, and that's going to be important for the next 3 things that I'm going to be speaking about. I'm going to do 1 slide on how this is how we measure corruption in this study. 2, I'm going to speak about the interventions, and 3, I'm going to present the results. So, in terms of measurement, it is the most challenging part of the study is to observe what is very hard to observe, and it's illicit behavior, not just at the street, but also inside police stations. Describing the credibility of the system would take a lot of time. I'm just going to give you the main essence. So in order to observe all these corrupt flows, we hire 160 individuals, civilians, judicial police officers, fine collection agents, individuals in minibuses, in order to get the total amount of money that enters into the system through the police officers in the street, the total amount of cars that go to the station, and everything that happens inside the station. We also get access to the informal contracts between supervisors and police officers, that is, the quotas. So this allows us to have 2 levels, the traffic police officer revenue and the police station revenue, as well as the illicit contracts. Using these measurements as outcomes, we then are going to do 2 interventions. The first is we're going to increase the wage of police officers. And the second, because the study shows that, in fact, increasing the wage of police officers is problematic in the presence of these corrupt hierarchies, the next step is, well, we should think of intervening at higher levels. So the second interventions that we do is we actually provide incentives to the commanders, the supervisors, to reduce the quotas. And this allows us to answer 2 questions. First, what is the impact of the vertical hierarchy of corruption on public service? And second, a policy question. In the presence of corrupt hierarchies, should we intervene at higher levels instead? So this is where the study takes place, which is half of one of the largest cities of Democratic Republic of the Congo. I'm not going to spend time discussing this, but you get an idea of how complicated the data collection system was. And we have all sorts of validation systems on each data point. So multiple observers of different affiliations are giving us information about the money that's coming through. Interventions, the first is we give cash to police officers, and we do this randomly. 2 objectives. The first is, does higher income reduce corruption? But most importantly in the study, how does it interact with supervisors and with the drivers, the organization of corruption? And the second is the reduction of the quota, which illicit quota, because it's mostly generating corruption. And that allows us to answer, does pressure from supervisors increase or decrease public service or distort public service? And second question, in the presence of this corrupt hierarchy, should we instead target the higher levels? So wage randomization provides a useful example to think about challenges of RCTs and how this can be solved in practice. So one of the problems was that giving cash to certain police officers but not others would generate jealousies and potentially conflict. So what we did is we agreed with the police teams that we would give cash not to individual police officers, but to police teams of 4 individuals, so that each day an entire police team would receive the same amount of cash. But the second is that every police team in the staff of the traffic police knew in advance that they had a predetermined number of days in which they would receive cash. okay, and everyone would receive the same. So in expectation, there was no inequality. So we're going to compare police teams in days that they have more cash to days where they have less cash. And the cash intervention is very large. We double the total income that they generate in a given day at the intersection. So that allows us to look at three things: characterizing the corrupt hierarchy. Having done this, that allows us to look at the main question, the effect of the higher wage, and then I'll have one slide on what happens when we target the incentives of the supervisor rather than the civil servant. So characterizing the corrupt hierarchy, in green, this graph shows the cumulative revenue that we measure in the system in a typical police station, including all the staff of that police station at the intersections. In green is the revenue generated in terms of formal fines that enters the fine collection agency network. Some of these might later be diverted, but at least we know that this is what enters into the system. And that's what economists, public finance economists would look at. The dark gray is what development economists would look at. They'll say, well, there's lots of corruption in the street. We're able to estimate that, in fact, the amount generated in terms of bribes collected in the street is larger than the fines collected at the street. But most importantly, and that's the point of the study, the amount generated inside police stations by the quota system is larger than both of them together. And so at the end of the month, one police station makes approximately $4,000 of bribes inside the police station. That implies that 78% of the total revenue of a police officer is generated through the bribes that he collects at the street. To the left is the formal wage. Right after, to the right, is the total revenue that they generate at the street. And in red is how much in total we estimate they give to the supervisor in cash from that amount. In terms of the police station, we cannot separate the revenues of the commander and the two judicial police officers. So here's the three people together. When you look at their wage, 94% of the revenue of this team is generated through the bribes that are generated inside the police station. 6% is the formal wage. So what's the effect of the higher wage in that context? So just to summarize very quickly, when we double the income that police officers receive at the intersection, first we see some slight decreases in corruption, not very high, even though the amount that we're giving is huge. Second, the decrease in corruption is driven by absenteeism. So what we see is that in the days where we give cash, and especially in the hours after cash is given, police officers are harder to be found at the intersection. And that is associated to a significant increase in traffic jams. In fact, we have also complementary evidence showing that the amount of alcoholic beverage consumed increases drastically, and the consumption of beer is something that traffic police often does, especially because it's considered to be difficult work, and drinking beer decreases the moral cost of extorting drivers. So that's how individuals respond. So here's some graphs that I'm going to skip to move to. That was the first relationship. I'm going to move to the second relationship, which is police officers and supervisors. So what happens when we give cash to police officers? The first is that we estimate at the end of the very same day where cash is given, we are able to see that at least 30% ends up in the pocket of the commanders. So somehow similar numbers to some of the numbers that Mike was speaking about initially. And not only money goes up, but the higher income of police officers also changes in some intersections the contracts that they have with commanders in terms of quota. So in particular, what we see is that in the intersections where the quota system was not efficient for them, quotas decrease and more cash is sent up, much more than in other intersections, and total corruption increases. So what this is evidence for, and it's precisely in the intersections where theory predicts that this should happen, which is in the intersections where the commander is not very good at extracting bribes, but the officer is. And so that one implications of this is that increasing wage in places where there is this sophisticated contracts can actually have exactly the opposite effect that one wants. And finally, this is the last slide on the results. When we move up to the higher level and incentivize the commander to reduce the quota that the commander is asking to the drivers, to the police officers, we find first a significant decrease in the number of cars arrested, because police officers are arresting car in the morning until they meet the quota, and they only arrest cars because they have a quota. Number two, we see a significant improvement in traffic flow, which is function one of the police. What does it tell us is that the organization of the corrupt hierarchy distorts the allocation of time of police officers away from regulating traffic flows to enforcement. It is unclear whether it's good or bad. It depends on what the government prefers, traffic flows or enforcement. But in this case, because officers have to spend a lot of time in the day arresting cars, they don't spend time regulating traffic flows as a result of the commander. But it's also possibly the case that, in fact, they generate traffic jams because it makes it much easier to arrest cars. And that's something that we know is anecdotically true. So compared to a system where there's no supervisor, and police officers might spend all their time regulating traffic to get tips, the presence of a corrupt supervisor allows to increase enforcement. So in the context of a fragile state, you might want to think of whether to tolerate some forms of vertical corruption, depending on what's the objective of the government. And so this type of vertical corruption could be thought of as a pay for performance if it was legalized for the supervisor. So I'm going to wrap up. So what changed as a result of the policy? From the point of view of the government, nothing. And so one of the questions is, when you think especially in corruption policy, and corruption is the very basis of governance in fragile states, especially in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the whole political system hinges on revenues made through the corrupt system. When money flows up to the top of agencies, then how do we think of partnering with governments who are beneficiaries from the system that policies aim to eradicate? Implications for future programming, visibility or readability. I think, especially in this context, it seems that a lot of effort is necessary before designing and implementing policies to understand the network of relationships that govern corruption. Tolerating some type of corruption might be better. Tips might actually be a way where fragile states who cannot monitor civil servants well enough or incentivize them might be a way by which they can allow them to provide some service. Tolerating this quota system and the bribes inside police stations might be a way by which enforcement is induced. And so I'll close here with two conclusions. Increasing wages can increase corruption in some cases, especially in places where the police officers are very poor. And increasing wages can harm public service in some places, especially where corruption is institutionalized and there are social norms where drivers have to pay in exchange for service. And I'll wrap here with the political economy of traffic lamps. Donors were very enthusiastic to develop traffic lamps in the city of Kinshasa because it was obvious that corruption was linked to the work of traffic police officers. But a few days after these were created, they were sabotaged by criminals or individuals linked to the police because it's part of the revenue made by the police. So just a note of caution on thinking of the political economy behind this type of policies. So that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for that great presentation. I hope that Raúl can come to Liberia, as I have been shaken down many times while traveling in Monrovia. So excellent work and necessary. So I'm going to present work today on engineering in formal institutions, on the experimental impacts of alternative dispute resolution on violence and property rights in Liberia. And this is joint work with Rob and Chris. So I thank them for their participation. I'd also like to send a big thank you to the many Liberian researchers who worked on this project with us over many years. Without them, this project would not have been possible. And so including Prince Williams, David Lama, and many others who did qualitative work and provided survey research assistance during this project. Okay, so the question that motivates this study, which is I'm going to present two rounds of research. This has been going on since 2009. And one of the main questions is, can we teach peace? So can we actually provide skills, training, and knowledge to people that can reduce violence in their everyday lives? And can outside organizations be the motivation or the important operator in teaching peace? Can they engineer improvements in local institutions and reduce violent disputes in post-conflict settings? So this is a goal that many international organizations and government actors have in fragile states. And more importantly, can we think about a more general question about top-down interventions when we study something like teaching peace? So is it possible to come in at a high level and teach a set of norms and skills that are elite-driven and see some kind of impact? So a lot of development interventions and humanitarian interventions to some extent focus on an elite-centered approach, which we might criticize and have been, I think, thoroughly criticized in some streams of literature. So it's important to take a look and see what the evidence says about that. And then finally, we can think about whether these approaches are cost-effective. So if we do see some kind of impact from teaching peace, providing training, is that a good value for money, which I know is an important focus for many folks in this room. So the context of this study is Liberia, and it's going to be a rural study. So we're focusing on areas that were heavily affected by the Liberian Civil War, and it's areas that are also disproportionately affected by violence and displacement. So we have a lot of population movement, and that will become a key part of this story. It's also a situation that's in a transition from a conflicted state to development, and I think that's also increasingly an area of interest. So immediately in the post-conflict period, we also see this effort to create opportunities for development, and we're seeing this blend of humanitarian programming and development programming, often with different actors, starting new collaborations, right? So we see this in this study as well. However, the reach of the state remains weak in this context. So we're coming in several years after the first democratic election, about 5 or 6 years after the signing of the peace agreement, but the state has a lot of things on its plate, and I think as Rohini was speaking of, we can also focus on lower level interventions, so engaging with government at the local level rather than at the central level, and this is an example in this intervention, also involving non-state actors at the same time. So the context that we're looking at here is one where in many rural areas, it's very expensive to access certain kinds of justice. Traveling to courts or to urban centers is not an option for many people. There are a proliferation of other authorities that are stepping in to deal with disputes. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about disputes? So some survey data helps illustrate the point. Many people have small disputes over property, and I'm talking real property, so land, housing, and then also movable property. This also might have to do with contracting, debts, fines, the sort of things that we would see in any neighborhood, in any place, all over the world, okay? So this study is going to focus on property disputes, real property disputes, which are a particular issue in Liberia, and what I have found to also be the case in many post-conflict countries that have been affected by large-scale displacement. So people have gone away from their homes, from their farms, if it's an agricultural setting, which this is, and then they've come back. And oftentimes when you come back, someone else is in your spot, as they would say in Liberia, okay? And this is creating a surfeit of property disputes, right? So one of the points we make in this analysis is that, in fact, there's some equilibrium of property rights disputes that exist in all societies, okay? So we're not looking to remove property disputes that would not be necessary or feasible, right? But we are going to think about an intervention that can reduce the volume of disputes that occur, especially in the post-conflict period where we have a lot of contested property rights. So in 2010, 1 in 5 people have a dispute over land or other real property. 1 in 10 report the dispute results in violence of some kind. And we can understand the situation as a bargaining failure where institutions fail to bring disputing parties to the table and create durable solutions to conflict. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but just to say we can imagine a court system as being a moment where parties can come together to bargain over the resolution of a dispute, right? And if the court system can work as a mechanism of enforcement and coordination and reduce the costs of finding a resolution that both parties will follow to a dispute. In the absence of a court system, and when I'm using the term court system, I'm not only talking about formal courts or what we might be familiar with here, I'm talking about a variety of actors who might serve as a way of bringing people together to the table, if you will, right? And actually helping people to come to a resolution that will reduce violence or reduce conflict. Okay, so given the situation where we have a high volume of property rights disputes, we have many authorities who are offering their services in dispute resolution, but we still have a proliferation of disputes and we have high levels of local level violence. What can the international community or the Liberian government do in such a situation? So in this case, the United Nations Refugee Agency was interested in trying to increase the resilience of these communities, which were also return communities in this context, where people were returning from displacement in neighboring countries. And they in turn partnered with a local organization, which is a part of a network run by the Catholic Church, to teach alternative dispute resolution. The UN hoped that such a program could improve local dispute resolution practices at the community level. So this is an intervention that operated at a community, with some exceptions. I can talk a little bit about that. And the goal is to reduce tension and violence around property rights, which is seen as a trigger for return to conflict. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about ADR, or alternative dispute resolution. That's also sometimes referred to as collaborative dispute resolution or mediation. So this is a very widespread practice, both in American, European courts of law, and then also in other parts of the world. And it can be referred to by different names. There are different judicial or dispute resolution practices involved in ADR. So what we might think of immediately is mediation. That's where a neutral party brings together disputing parties and they help them reach a mutually agreeable solution to a conflict that is self-enforcing often. We might think of arbitration, where we have a similar actor who brings people together, but the resolution to the dispute may be binding. This is something we find a lot in business transactions, right, in our own context. And it's also very analogous to what happens in the chief's court in this rural setting, right? So the chief may be a neutral party, often not, okay? But they may play the role of the arbiter. They may bring people together. Someone may not be satisfied with the outcome, but it is binding. So they are supposed to follow the decision of the local authority. Whether that occurs or not is dependent on the context and the strength of that authority. So ADR teaches all people in the community who attend the training how to resolve disputes. So in effect, it creates more actors, which may seem counterintuitive, who have the skills, if the program works, to engage in dispute resolution. So these involve basic skills of communication, listening, finding out information, okay, managing emotions, reducing violence. And there was also a component of the training that it was about civic education. So it was also relating to strengthening the legitimacy of the Liberian government, even in this diffusion of informal dispute resolution. The training was rolled out in communities over a period of an average of 2 months. So every week, 1 day of training was held. These are agricultural communities where an intensive training program like this one could not be held all at once. People have other things they're doing. So a cohort would be trained 1 day a week over several months. Trainers lived in the community and formed relationships with the community members and provided mentorship for people who were becoming dispute resolvers, if you will. Now, I would just like to say I attended many of these trainings myself, and what's very interesting about this process is that there are some people who really take to dispute resolution and are natural dispute resolvers, and this training really facilitated those people and empowered them to resolve disputes. So I don't know if you can think about your friends or your family members. Some people are really happy to sort of help other people resolve problems, and they may be even very good at it, increasing communication between people who are in conflict. So for local level issues, this identified those people and gave them tools to resolve problems. Okay, so how does this work? We have a training program. The UN is excited to roll it out. We have a local implementation partner, and we want to understand if this is actually having the results that the theory of change or the UN and other actors, the Liberian government, are hoping for. So what we did is we had local officials nominate 246 conflict-prone communities. You can see the blue dots on the slide. Those are the eligible communities, and they're mostly in the border areas, right, with Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. These are the areas that saw high levels of violence during the civil conflict and very high levels of return. We should also note that these areas do have a history of sort of insecure property rights, both related to the conflict and related to tensions between various ethno-linguistic groups. This is an area where we do see tensions between so-called settlers or outsiders, right? And then between groups that claim self-identify as indigenous to the area. So all of this is happening in a context where property rights in particular are often a source of contestation. So what we do is we randomize the treatment of communities, the implementation order that the local NGO carried out, and the intensity. And it's a good thing because this was a very resource-rich program. It required a lot of money to implement, in part because this was a very difficult to reach area of the country. Liberia is very small, but the road network at this time did not support movement very easily. So a lot of this was done on motorbike or by walking into villages with the materials for the training. So it was very expensive to carry out. And as a result, the implementing partner did run out of money. I think we could have done another study on our study about leakage and hierarchies. Okay, so That was happening. And so in order to protect against this, as we knew this going in, this was going to be challenging, we randomized the communities into 5 phases, right? So that meant that if the program should stop at some point, we knew that the communities that had already received the treatment or had experienced the ADR training were actually a random subset of our entire sample. We also looked at intensity. So I think another key point of the program, which is important to note, is that it was a very intense program. Many training programs that I've observed in my short time in the field, I would say, the proverbial field, is that we talk about training, we talk about capacity building, as someone was mentioning earlier, and skill development, but we're talking about a 1 or 2 day interaction between someone who has expertise and then the people who are learning. And so this was not what we were focusing on here. This was a longer period of engagement between the trainer and the trained. And then we also trained a much larger group within the community that is typical for this kind of program. So we're training about 15% of the adults in the community, which is quite high. And the goal of this was to expand beyond the social network of the community leaders. So as is quite normal in these kinds of interventions, we need to gain community access, right? So the state and the UN have a lot of sway, but for something like this to be successful, we need community leaders to say, yes, of course, you can come and live in our community for 2 months and train people. And we're potentially also taking away a revenue stream, right? If we're going to empower other people to resolve disputes, resolving disputes is often a paid service, right? So there could have been some reluctance for folks to engage. And one of the reasons, so we naturally needed to train all the community leaders first. However, if we had done that, we might have worried that the intervention itself would not have fulfilled its goal, which is to actually empower additional people to resolve disputes. So we did then push the training to many other classes within each community in order to have wide coverage. Okay, so what did we find? So after about a year of training many thousands of people across rural Liberia, what happened? So in one sense, this program worked as planned. We were all thrilled to discover this, especially since we were quite skeptical about the ability to see change in the first instance. After 1 year, we see the same volume of disputes. So we don't actually see that there are less conflicts that are occurring, but we do see that the backlog gets resolved. So we see an increasing number of resolutions. This is compelling. And then 1, and especially 3 years later, because we collected data on average 10 months after program implementation, and then we went back and did it 36 months later, we see that disputes over real property are less violent. So when we ask someone about whether they've had a property rights dispute, and we ask them if there was any incident of violence associated with the dispute, we find that people report less violence 3 years later. Now, this is a puzzle. We want to know how this has actually occurred. In the first round of data collection, we did not have as much information about why people would be reporting less violence if they were indeed bargaining differently with these new informal dispute resolvers. And in the third round of data collection, we see some limited evidence of the mechanism that we hypothesized to work. So we do see that people report that they've changed norms around managing their emotions and reducing violence during the dispute resolution process. However, not everything went as planned. So just as Raúl's presentation showed, some interventions, which are kind of standard development interventions, have unintended consequences that we can't anticipate. And that occurred here as well. So in the first instance, the intervention breaks even after 3 years only if avoiding a violent dispute is worth an amount equal to twice the average Liberian's annual income. That is to say that the total cost of the program, this is a very back of the envelope calculation here, but when we're doing, I think, cost analysis, that's sometimes where we end up. So the cost of one dispute or one violent incident removed is about $700 or $800. Is that a good value for money? Well, I've asked this question to numerous audiences when presenting this work, and I get a lot of variation in responses. Some people say, yeah, actually, the reduction of one violent incident is worth 2 years of salary. And other people are not convinced. So one thing we could think about when taking this work forward would be to think of cheaper ways of getting these skills out there, okay? So maybe it's possible to have the same level of skill transfer or norm change with a cheaper mechanism, maybe edutainment or radio broadcasts. That could be researched in the future. We also see a short-run rise in extrajudicial punishment. This is not a huge effect, but it is significant in the short term. And I think it's important to highlight, it suggests that we are empowering people to take matters into their own hands when they're resolving disputes, and that some of that leads to things we would classify as extrajudicial punishment. So what does this mean? Okay, well, I think it varies a lot by context, but I can say a few words about it. It means that people report, for example, something like trial by fire. So everyone is gathered in the community. If there is some kind of dispute, someone who is accused of engaging in behavior that is not sanctioned by the community may be forced to drink a special drink, which might be potentially poisonous, although often may not be. There's a lot of uncertainty around that. And the result, though, of the social pressure, the mechanism of the extrajudicial punishment, is that people confess to wrongdoing. Now, this is illegal under Liberian criminal law. It's a social mechanism that is found in many contexts, probably even in our own in various forms, right? But it is not an effect that we would wish to increase as a result of this kind of program, so we might think in revising program materials to avoid this in the future. And then we also see a finding which is a little bit more complex and requires, I think, further work, but I think is also probably relevant for other interventions of this type, is that longer term, we see that the intervention favors the property rights security of the powerful. So in the second round of data collection, we spent a lot of trying to understand how secure or how confident people felt in their ability to take returns from an investment in property rights. Were they willing to put up fences? Were they willing to clear land that they hadn't previously cleared? Did they think that they had the right to say who their land would go to when they died, or if they wanted to alienate certain amounts of land? And we found that for some people, this increases or is unchanged by the program, and then for other people, property rights security goes down. And this is for people who are further away from the chief in terms of their social network. This echoes other findings on agricultural work in West Africa, and I think it suggests that we reinforced institutions at the bottom level that were not particularly inclusive, right? So we, in some way, enforced dispute resolution structures that relied on power structures at the local level, and reinforcing these institutions had an unintended consequence. And it speaks to a trade-off which I see in different kinds of programming of this type, which is between sustainability, which is building on institutions that exist, that may be exclusive, and that don't include certain groups, particularly minorities or women, versus inclusivity, which would mean a fundamental change in the balance of power and incentives at the local level. And this intervention did not seek to do that, nor did it. Thanks.
Right, okay. I'm conscious that it is 11:15 and we've got coffee due at 11:30, and I think we're hoping to have a little bit of time for questions. Is that all right? So I'm going to canter through. I've written lots of things down, and I'm going to canter through them. And I just wanted, what I've been asked to do is just think about the relevance of the research to DFID programming, either in these countries or globally, the relevance of it to the broader policy community in the UK and beyond, and then what other research might be useful that would be helpful in the same way that these particular programs are. So I'm not sure whether I'm going to manage to answer all of those, but very quickly, Peter Evans is the head of our Governance, Conflict, Social Development Research team. You'll be hearing from him later. And I just asked him before we came here, in how assured are we that the things that end up getting run and funded are the most relevant to us, given that we're a funder of the programme. And he was explaining the process that the sort of competitive bids go through. But I'd just like to say that those three, are I feel really encouraged by that, because I can see direct relevance, direct programme relevance to us. So just starting very quickly with at the Afghanistan example. So 50%, we have a commitment of 50% of our funding being allocated to fragile conflict-affected states. And we recognise very much the need to invest in basic services. And we used to, many years ago, provide general budget support to countries, but this came to very abrupt halt when I think it was the president of Tanzania, if DFID colleagues can remind me, bought a plane and a personal jet. And at that point, we've had one this week, a very similar one in Rwanda. I don't know if you saw the story in the news about them sponsoring, is it Arsenal Football Club? And obviously then there's immediately a story in the news about the fact that the UK is giving aid to Rwanda, and then Rwanda is spending from their tourist board 30 million quid, although they disputed that figure, on sponsoring Arsenal. And, obviously that's not UK taxpayers' money going straight to Arsenal Football Club, but you can see how it plays out. So obviously, so these examples are really important to test. Our long-term plan is to exit all aid relationships, and obviously in a post-Brexit world, we want new partnerships. The UK is looking for new partnerships, ultimately trading relationships with countries as they develop. So, it's when we moved to sector budget support, we did so with very robust financial management processes, checks and balances there. We're basically paying either the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank or maybe another to help administer the funding that was going to support a particular sector, be it the health sector or education sector. And that's not long-term sustainable, and we obviously want national systems to be working really well. So the activities like this can inform our risk level really effectively as we programme at a country level. It helps us to design mitigation strategies, and it helps us with our country planning processes as we embark on making our choices. As I said, in the context of the new spending review, we will be planning at a country level. So a challenge is to make sure that those who are undergoing those processes in country for DFID are able to access information from studies like this, and that goes for the wider development community as well. The DRC example was really, really interesting. Like my colleague said, I've been stopped in Senegal actually entering a city in my car, and had my passport and my paperwork taken off me until I paid a bribe. And then I ended up going to the police station. This was one that perhaps bucked the trend. Went to the police station to pay the bribe, and the supervisor there said, "What on earth are you coming here to? What bribe? What are you talking about? Who was it? Where was he?" So he got in the car. We drove back to where this chap was. He'd gone home with my passport and all my paperwork. So we drove round to his house, and he got a fair old ticking off, and we got all of our paperwork back. So I'm sure that's not, that's probably the exception rather than the norm. Anyway, we have police reform is a massive focus of many DFID country offices programmes, but also we're increasing the investment that we're making in infrastructure as well. It's really important to be testing the assumptions that we're making when we're choosing the investments. I felt it was a very interesting. It was an interesting picture of the balance of power within the police system as well. And it helps us to tell us what hasn't worked when you think it might work. So, of course, when I'm listening to your reporting, I'm expecting it all to be a story of success, and that we tried this and it worked and it improved this, and it's really interesting to see what hasn't worked and what it therefore tells us, but also what other incentives could be tested out is a question that it would be good to hear from you folk about, as well as whether there are any comparisons or differences between countries and any other similar studies elsewhere. Finally, in terms of Liberia, we obviously along with other donors, we pour millions into fragile and conflict-affected states, not necessarily really understanding the context and the detail of what causes the conflict. We have a lot of activity on it and a lot of research on it. But we do have one central programme on land reform that works in, I think, around 6 African countries. But we actually have quite little expertise in DFID on land reform. And so, studies like this are really important to help us become more informed. I know the backlog of cases, certainly in a country like Bangladesh that I mentioned before, the backlog of of legal cases is massive, and an awful lot of those are around land dispute. So alternative dispute resolution solutions are already being tested, but how much more we can know about what's effective and what's not is essential. And then obviously there are long memories and the potential for future flare-ups is really important to consider. So what more can it tell us in terms of that? I thought the point about how quickly you can expect to get results is key. We tend to plan on a 4 to 5 year cycle. It's linked to the political cycle and the spending cycle, but actually we're all, as practitioners, we're all aware that it takes an awful lot longer for programs to really bear fruit. And so we quite often end up extending them. So should we be planning on a longer basis? And the return on investment is a very, very good question, and we often get asked that by ministers. Why should I spend money on, research into high volume transport rather than on a humanitarian crisis elsewhere in the world? So we have to be able to answer that rigorously. So overall, other things to think about, I think gender and inclusion issues. Where might technology help more? We certainly have a Secretary of State who's very interested in expanding our work on technology. And then in terms of what other research it would be useful to try, I feel like that's one to throw open to the room. So thanks very much.
Great, thank you. At this point, I'd like to open it up for questions. Are there any questions from the audience? Sure, perhaps the both of you could start. You can start, yeah.
You touched on the issue of ADR and how it affects women particularly in Liberia. I was really interested to know, sorry, it's Sarah McGuire from DAI. I was really interested to know whether any of the others noticed any gender disparities, or whether you looked at any gender issues, like with the issue of police officers over time. Did that make a difference if the police officer was male or female? Did it make a difference if the supervisor was male or female? I think I sort of know the answer because I know the situation. And similarly in Afghanistan, did it make a difference? A lot, like you're saying, a lot of the teachers, 60% of the teachers are female. Was women's low status in society a cause of the way that corruption and the leakages happen there? So is there something that we can learn there about the intersection of gender dynamics in these forms of corruption?
Okay, so 3 hands quickly went up, so I would say let's get those 3 questions in, and then let's have the answers, and then let's take the break so that we can come back for the next session. Natalia, you had your hand went up as well.
Hi, I'm Natalia from the Global Innovation Fund. Sort of having been a sort of policymaker in a developing country, I often sort of think about the limitations of evidence, because often the policies have to be the result of a political process and a political consensus. And I would argue that distribution of money, for example, in the UK, is a result of a political process, and evidence informs the priors of the people that participate in the political process. And how is this sort of taken into account when thinking about distribution of aid resources? Because sort of on the one hand, we've heard from Kenny that you cannot ignore sort of the political process, and on the other hand, we actually claim that the aid resources should be prioritized by evidence. And I actually find the story about the MP and sort of the campaign to orient the resources towards cataract surgeries, for example, quite striking, because it comes from an MP that most of the time doesn't just orient all the money to cataract surgeries in the UK. So it would be wonderful to sort of think about how difficult it is thinking about the evidence in terms of informing this political process.
Okay, and we'll just take one more question. The man in the one row back. Yeah, with your hand up.
Yeah, Thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Statecraft, but my question is related to my immediate previous work. In the summing up, there was a comment about putting a lot of assistance into conflict and fragile states without necessarily understanding the reasons. And my question is based on conversations with people who've worked on such international programs, and I've been struck by failure to mention issues which I think were really public knowledge as being highly relevant in relation to conflict generation and reducing the conflict threat. My question is, are there any indications of any particular international organizations or NGOs which are particularly aware of this issue and dealing with it? Or by implication, by exclusion, are there any cases where they're not? I have to say, having seen certain UN operations in action, I'm an admirer of DFID, I'm an admirer generally of nation-state efforts, but I'm certainly not an admirer of the United Nations.
Who would like to start?
I would particularly cite certain issues in the African Great Lakes region, where I frankly think too many people were there on holiday, having a taxpayer-funded holiday.
Would any of you want to?
Mine's easy.
Yeah, I mean, so just to speak to the question about sort of gender dynamics, as you rightly pointed out, so we do focus quite a lot on gender dynamics in our study, and there's definitely a suggestion that people of lower status do not fare as well as a result of the program and may even be negatively affected by the program. And I think this comes back to the last point that I was raising in the presentation, which is that interventions often have a set of intended impacts and then a set of unintended impact, and then there are a set of unintended impacts. And, taking into account the balance of power and what is actually occurring on the ground. An example of Raúl's work, I think, is a great example of this. It can help us to anticipate certain unintended consequences, perhaps. But I also think that there's a trade-off. So I do think that there's a lot to be said for reinforcing existing institutions, or not reinventing the wheel, which is why, as Rohini pointed out, it's good to support state actors when we're doing this kind of work. On the other hand, if change needs to be made at a fundamental level, for example, if we are buying into a rights-based framework when we're doing our implementation or our programming, then that is a process which is but has costs as well as benefits, is what I would say.
In regard to the gender impacts of the first project, the Ministry of Labor in Afghanistan, we also invested pretty substantially in trying to understand sort of the gender consequences. The minister for the Ministry of Labor was a woman and was directly interested in this as well. And there's sort of a logic that it might, because the idea being if you have money in your mobile wallet versus in your bank account, you may be able to sort of have more authority over it in making household decisions. We invested quite a bit in exploring that. We don't see any clear impact that's positive in that regard. But again, this was just a pilot. It's a small pilot. We're going to also investigate that at scale in the Ministry of Education, and the result may be different, but so far we haven't seen any impact.
All right, so also on the gender and the police, I'm aware of some research that looks at the effect of the gender of police officers on resolving crime and the relationship with civilians. Some of the evidence suggests that different types of police officers have, some police officers have responses to crime that are better, and this tends to correlate with gender. Not just gender, but some evidence that female police officers are better at resolving crime or at engaging with criminals. And if I can also put you in contact with some researchers that are currently working on developing an RCT in India and Peru exactly looking at this question. In the context of this study, about 30% of the traffic police officers are women. The study was not designed to look at the effect of gender, but nonetheless, we have some correlations in the study that might be suggestive and some anecdotes. It turns out in this particular context that police officers who are women are more aggressive with police drivers for two reasons. The first is signaling, because they face more aggressive drivers who are less intimidated. So in order to assert their authority, they tend to be more aggressive. That's a complaint of drivers, mostly male drivers. But the second, actually, which I think is more relevant, is that female police officers seem to be very concerned with getting money to pay the education fees and health of their children, while male police officers tend to be very concerned with private consumption, and it links to the beer consumption that I talked before, which is one of the largest share of their consumption basket. So as a result, there's this interesting and counterintuitive implication of gender in this context. I think one question that is not clear in this context that could be very useful. So supervisors are all men in this context, but the relationship with supervisors could actually be quite affected. And so a female police officer could be actually weaker in this relationship, and so there may be some aspects of inclusion there that we haven't looked at. For now, this study is not well suited to answer that, in particular because the quotas and the rules are assigned at the team level, which are mixed when there is a woman. However, we also conducted a study that attempted to characterize all the payments that households make through representative survey in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This was funded by DFID Congo, actually. We did an RCT to look at how different interventions might allow to empower households in the face of corrupt tax officials. And one of the findings we had is that households led by a woman have a much higher informal tax burden in their payments. So it seems to suggest that there is a gender bias in the power relation with tax officials in the ability to negotiate bribes. Whether it is asymmetric social networks, maybe men are better connected through male groups, or whether it is other sorts of bargaining power, we cannot tell, but there is evidence for that.
Diana, would you like to have the last word?
Well, I was just going to answer the bit about politics and choices. And I mean, for us, you know, politics in the UK, of course, plays a role in that. And particularly, you know, we have a sustained attack by a certain newspaper on, you know, looking for waste, looking for poor choices. And the ministers are really sensitive to that. So we do, I mean, this is where evidence is hugely important, that, you know, we're using evidence to make the decisions. When there's a change of minister, they come in with a new set of priorities, but that's not to say that all the other priorities get left behind and we just move on. It's a case of doing everything, but some things get more exposure and will get communicated more to the public than others around what the ministerial priorities are. But in terms of local politics, the country offices and the programmes that are operational in places where we don't actually have a presence will do the political economy analysis to make sure that whatever sector or thematic programme you're running has taken into account that. You know, and with a view of sustainability, the state actors are really, really important in that. So, you know, I mean, in the case of Anne Main, you know, it was just really hard work and quite a sustained attack, but we didn't close any of our governance programmes, we justified them. And in the minister supported us in that because he felt it was the right thing we were doing as well. So I mean, you have to go through it. Sometimes that's what we do is, you know, it's public money, so we have to justify the expenditure. But sometimes, you know, it's a more difficult sell, which is where this really robust evidence is playing a key role. The question on conflict, I was going to hand over. I can see Charlie Morris, who's our conflict advisor in the research team. I don't know whether you want to come back on that, or we can do it over the break. Do you want to just summarise your question again?
Yeah. Are there any indications of particular national or international organisations or major NGOs who seem to be rather better at understanding conflict and therefore reacting rather better in dealing with its mitigating problems
if it's
I mean, I think we've got a number of there's a number of organisations represented in the room here today who've worked on, who are working in conflict-affected areas. The people in charge of specific issues also, Save the World are here today. So it'd be very interesting to hear some of those perspectives actually on how you think the local level contextual work that you're doing can complement this kind of rigorous efforts through the RCTs. And so, I think there are a range of organisations who have incredibly deep knowledge and expertise. A number of our other research programmes are also doing some of this deep political analysis, and I think it's fascinating for me, especially on things like land rights and dispute resolution processes, to be able to have this robust evidence and look at that alongside it, because I think that gives us a really strong case on the range of these kinds of areas. I think, I said because we work in so many different contexts, different agencies have different strengths.
Context is everything.
So I would also just say that there may be challenges faced by some of the bigger agencies, like UN in some places, but there are also examples where they're doing some really incredible work as well. So I think it's important to recognise.
Thanks.
okay. Great. Well, thank you. We've run a little bit over schedule, so I would like to thank our speakers as well as our audience for your participation.